Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the You and Jonny Blue podcast, episode number 7. I'm really excited today. We are talking about self-care, and we have a marriage and family therapist, somebody who has a lot of experience in this area, and somebody who is also actively meeting with clients who are struggling because of the current pandemic and a lot of the crises that result emotionally, physically, and otherwise. So I'm really excited. You can find her on Instagram. Her Instagram is Soulful Psychology, and there will be a link in the bio. But she posts really good content on there that kind of mirrors some of the things that we're talking about now. And she has a part of a practice in San Diego. So if you're interested in meeting with her, I'll provide her contact details. But her name is Miss Kylie Baker. Kylie, thanks so much for being here today.
You're welcome.
Hey,
I'm glad to be
so
here.
I'm just excited to talk to an expert, somebody who actually knows a lot about this because it's not something I know a lot about, and I'm looking forward to learning more about it. But self-care is something that people talk about a lot. It's a term people throw around quite a bit. But I want to ask you to talk about self-care a little bit and maybe give us just kind of a general framework so that we can understand the term a little bit better before we dive further into it.
Sure thing. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, it is. I think it's true. It's been kind of thrown around a lot for good reason. I think it's a movement overall for people to kind of relearn how to take care of themselves because there's kind of an assumption that like most people have missed for various reasons have missed the ability to care for themselves in childhood. So whether it's on purpose, intentional or not, parents, I really do believe most parents are doing the best that they can, but they often come up short when it comes to meeting every single need all the time throughout every day for a child, of course. And so it's sort of learning where those areas were deficient and how to care for yourself as an adult, taking responsibility for your care. And often that means like 4 different domains that I typically see. Those domains usually fall in categories that I would just call like body care. So there's like physical, it's like people talk about exercise, rest, nutrition, having enough water, enough sleep, those basic physiological needs, nature,
Okay.
connecting to nature.
All right.
A second domain would be pleasure, which I would categorize sort of like social connections, hobbies, joy, play, that kind of thing. And that usually assumes that body care is kind of already taken care of, like basic shelter, food, water, and all of that is taken care of before you can really move into having the capacity or ability to tap into pleasure. If you're homeless, finding a new hobby or learning a new language is going to be a little bit difficult, right? So there is kind of a hierarchy. There's actually, we can talk about this more later, but there's sort of a hierarchy of needs that's kind of assumed when we're talking about self-care. But that
Okay.
said, the 4 domains, so there's the physical, there's pleasure, then there's I would say like emotion regulation category. So it's like knowing I have an experience of emotions and I'm not overindulging with them and overly identifying with them, but I'm also not denying them, minimizing them, pushing them aside, ignoring them. And then the last category would be like rituals. I would kind of categorize like meditation or routines or structure, that kind of thing would be under sort of like finding discipline and rituals for yourself.
So those 4 ways that you mentioned are, if we approach self-care in each of those 4 areas, that will give us sort of like a well-rounded picture of self-care. In other words, like we'll care for sort of these 4 different areas of ourselves that are sometimes not cared for enough.
Yeah, exactly.
And it sounds like though that starts in childhood. And I just want to talk with you a little bit about that first, since that might be where these needs kind of originate from. Can you tell me a little bit more about what need, because it seems, I'm sure if parents are watching this, they're wondering like, well, how could I meet my child's needs? But it sounds like you're sort of saying that even when a parent does the best that they can, it's not possible to meet those entirely, right?
Yeah, because you've got, other factors happening too. You have like when the kid goes to a family's house, or when the kid goes to school, or, there's a lot of, it's conditioning too that we're talking about, like how we're conditioned to to like experience self-care, or even how it's modeled in the home. So it's it's like, yeah, if you think about the child's warmth, water, food intake, sleep, like sleep schedule, those are the most basic physiological needs. And can you imagine like a parent having two, three, four kids, and every single one of them having all of those needs met at all times? It's like, no, it just is. Humans are super complex and super dynamic, and their needs change all the time. The temperature one day is this, and the next day it's that, so it's,
Yeah.
it's pretty hard for parents to do that. And that's why I think this work doesn't always include like, being mad at our parents. Of course, there's the abusive and there's the intentional and neglectful side of things for sure. But then most parents are in that category, like you said, which is like they're doing their best they can, and yet it's nearly impossible to meet all of them, if possible at all. Yeah.
So let me ask you this. It might not be possible for them to meet their children's needs because they actually are maybe just there's too many needs or they're busy doing other things. But is it possible for a parent to limit the child's own ability to care for themselves by the parent being like overprotective? In other words, like if the parent is meeting too many of the child's needs then it actually is it possible that the child is stunted in their ability to learn to give themselves care as it
Mhm.
like early on?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that's what I would call kind of in the category of emotion regulation. It's sort of like, a child needs to learn the ability to like fall down and get back up and know that they're okay. And then they can
Right.
come to mom and say, "Oh, I'm hurting." But then if mom pulls the kid up, like stops them from falling each time, then a child can't really learn to walk that way. They have to actually learn, literally a toddler at 9 months to 18 months old, when they're kind of learning that process of walking, they have to learn the equilibrium of falling in order to actually do it. And so when a parent who's well intended to care for their child and love them well, picks them up before they can fall, that's actually stunting them. So it's exactly what you're saying. It's stunting. In the same way, emotionally, when they're like, "Oh no, don't cry. Oh no, no, no," just like overly concerned, that stunts the ability to then soothe or regulate themselves. There's that
Right.
continuum of like over meeting, but then under meeting, which is neglectful. And that's when
Right.
there's denial of needs or denial of,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like my mom is a fifth grade teacher, and she'll say, she'll have like a reward day for students who don't, who are never late or something for the quarter. And like the kids will have a pizza party if they meet whatever requirement she sets out. But then like she tells me that there's like parents who, if their child doesn't qualify for the reward, they'll like bring their children pizza on that day just so that they're not feeling left out from all the other kids who did qualify for the party. And it's like, they're doing that probably well meaning and in an attempt to prevent their child from feeling those feelings of like, feeling
Shame.
left out, feeling
Mm.
shame, feeling like inadequate, or, and so in a way they're doing, they're, they're doing the self-care for the children. They're preventing the child from feeling that, which in their mind is helpful, but it's like preventing the child from actually having the ability to learn how to do that, right?
I mean, that's a whole other conversation, I think, because when we're talking about childhood development, is shame actually helpful for children to learn? And most, newer studies would say no. And so having a child have the experience of shame isn't necessarily going to be helpful for the sense of self to develop. But that's a whole other thing, because preventing shame is different than preventing feeling sad or
Or
like
disappointment.
disappointment, or yeah. But often in a scenario like that, with that developmental age around 10 years old, that's tricky, because it likely would induce shame and a feeling of being excluded from the tribe. And so I'm not
Interesting.
an expert enough to speak to that, to be honest, but
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a really interesting topic, but we will table it for now. But right now with the quarantining and like the stay-at-home mandates and a lot of the things that we're all experiencing culturally and as a society right now, this seems like an appropriate time to talk about self-care. So to just dive a little further into it, like what are some challenges? I know you're working with clients still consistently. Are there things that you've noticed that are kind of patterns that people are kind of struggling with in the area of self-care, and how that kind of relates to what we're going through right now?
Yeah, really good question. So I had mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and so
Mm,
just to kind of mention that, like, oftentimes the self-care movement in the West kind of assumes that those bottom tiers of the pyramid of the hierarchy of needs, it's depicted as a pyramid. You can look it up. In those bottom tier parts, the first one is biological, physiological needs, so shelter, food. I would assume financial support on some level, and then the next one is safety and security. So self-care is often, like hobbies, pleasure, play. A lot of what we see in the West is more like that sort of self-actualization, which is actually at the top.
right,
Meditation, blah, 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 and it assumes
right,
these things are met. And so what's tricky right now, what I'm seeing a lot with my clients who are really financially impacted or have somebody in their families or lives that are immune compromised, feel really physically threatened by this disease or whatever. Um, and they're getting all these messages on social media that are about pleasure, learn a new skill or learn a language, or it assumes that just because there's time right now that we all have the same capacity for like that top tier of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And
right.
so that's often the tricky part, is that people are comparing or creating sort of generalizations or universal statements for what self-care should look like just everyone should be like napping and taking advantage of it and like resting. And if I just lost my job, I'm going to be up all night like resume building, and maybe it is resting for that person. But there's just going to be different needs for different people in this time, especially since safety and security, which is that second part of the second tier of the pyramid, that is going to feel threatened from a lot of people, if not everyone on some level. So it's
Okay.
tricky to go into those other domains of pleasure and play and beauty, which I'm not saying they're not accessible, but they can be more difficult to access when our capacity is bogged down by trying to make sure we feel safe and their physiological needs are met. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And so, because it sounds like when most people talk about self-care, they talk about like having a taking a bubble bath, or like, drinking some
Right.
wine or something like that, like you're saying on a physical level. Um, but but it sounds like you're saying that comparison is something that can really get in the way of true self-care, because everybody is at a different stage in terms of where they're at, what needs there need to be met in that hierarchy.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, like if I just lost my job as a result of this quarantine, or I have someone in my family who's immune compromised and I'm genuinely afraid for their life, sitting around drinking wine and taking bubble baths might not be in the cards for me. It might be, but it may be like checking in on loved ones. It just may look different. It may be more like doing what I can to soothe my emotional intensity that's happening as you know, appropriately.
Right, right. So let's start there. So in terms of what it looks like, what would be a way that somebody could delineate um, whether they should focus on like being there for themselves versus like doing things for themselves? And where, I know this is like maybe hard because everybody is in a different place, but like, is there a framework that we can use to try to figure out like, whether I need to soothe myself and be there for myself, care for myself that way, versus like, going shopping, or like, I don't know, doing something for myself that feels like I'm actively caring for myself.
That's a really good question, because I really do think self-care, like I said, in the West, like going out shopping and having a glass of
Right,
wine and all that, it
right.
does kind of assume economic privilege. And so then does
Mm,
that mean only the privileged can have care for themselves? It's like, no, I think it's what you're saying, which is a way of being with yourself. That's like everyone can do that. Everyone can
okay,
be with themselves in a way that's nurturing and caring and loving and kind. And so I would say
right,
the principles of self-care universally, if we're going to make any of them, are going to be self-compassion, sort of acceptance of oneself, like non-judgmental acceptance of where you are and what you need. Um,
hmm,
Presence, I would put in that category. And then mindful enjoyment, learning how to, like, if I'm going to meet my need, even in a way that is like having a glass of wine or something like that, that I'm going to do it mindfully so that I can actually integrate the care that it is receiving instead of doing it impulsively or without reflection, or, then we kind of miss the
okay.
function it's playing. So
So let's talk about that first one, like the first one you mentioned. What does it look like for me to be there for myself? I mean, I know
Yeah.
it's sort of a broad question, but that does require like sort of a self-assessment, right? I mean, I
Mm,
can't be there for myself if I don't know what needs I have that need to be cared for. And so our
mhm.
emotions can sometimes be like tricky because there's a lot, and it just feels, when something feels really strong, like approaching it and really diving down into it and figuring out what it is specifically. I mean, that's a lot, and when there's a
Mhm.
lot going on, like right now, when I'm just at home at night, if I'm feeling just upset and I don't really know what it is beyond that, where's a good place to start?
Sorry, cut out a little bit. You said when you're feeling what at night?
Well, if I'm just feeling upset,
Oh,
like
right.
I don't know if I'm feeling anxious about my job, or if I'm feeling upset that I can't hang out with my friends, or I'm feeling lonely, like if I don't even really know where I'm at or what specifically I'm struggling with, but I'm just generally upset. Like
Mm.
how would you sort of approach that
Yeah.
first?
Super good question. Yeah, I think that I think something I may have said to you before, or something I've just said a lot, I don't know, is just that need to be really mindful of how we're speaking to ourselves about our experience. So we're going to have an experience of this crisis that's happening. And that could be kind of numbing out and like denying that it's happening because it's too much to process. And it could be feeling upset and not really knowing why, feeling irritable, on edge, anxious, jumpy, and sort of even if you don't have an obvious reason, meaning you're not a nurse, you're not a doctor, you're not suffering physically, or you're not losing a loved one. So those are the more obvious ways to be upset. But then there's this sort of general impact that's sort of collective trauma that's happening right now. So
Mm-hmm.
so our nervous systems cannot not be impacted in some way of the massive change that's happening to our routines, to our structure, to our either finances, our going to work, not going to work. Everyone's impacted in some way. And so you know I just keep hearing too. It's like, well, why am I upset? Why am I anxious? I'm not actually, I still have my job, or I still have security, or, but
Right.
the reality is we cannot not be impacted on some level, even if it means numbness, not feeling it at all, um, to a collective threat. So biologically, we're going to do what we can with a threat, which means, again, like tuning it out or feeling kind of irritable about anything random. I'm mad at I actually found myself irritated that my dog was sniffing too much on walks recently. And I was like, seriously, I'm like, I'm finding myself impatient with an animal that is like innocent and I'm not usually impatient with. So even just
Right.
that moment of like, oh, because I feel out of control in a lot of areas of my life right now. And so even
Mm-hmm.
just noticing that. So how do I be with myself is like, oh, oh my gosh, of course you're feeling irritable. That is a symptom of fight, flight, freeze. Irritable, flighty, or numb. Like those are fight, flight, freeze, which are survival systems. So we're going to have some or one of those things happening, if not all of them daily. So I feel upset or lonely. It's like, I feel kind of frozen. I feel disconnected. That's freeze. That's a
Mm-hmm.
way our bodies are employing, like, hey, something's going on and danger's out there. And this is, what shows up: fight, flight, freeze. And so symptoms of that is going to be all these different emotions. So I would encourage in that, anyone experiencing this, which is everyone, is to check in and say, oh, like, of course you're struggling. There's a pandemic happening. There's danger out there. And of course my system's going to respond to that.
Okay. And so that kind of sounds like, would you classify that as sort of like the emotional regulation piece, like addressing that area by just starting to say, it's okay for me to feel how I'm feeling, whether that's like anxious, whether that's guilty, or feel, because I know some people, like, they aren't impacted as much as others that they know about, and they feel bad about it. They're sort of like, I don't have kids right now. Financially, I'm okay. I don't know anybody who's been sick, and I'm not sick. Everybody's struggling but me, and like I kind of feel bad saying that.
Hmm.
Um, I know some people have told me that, and I kind of feel that way personally. I mean,
Oh,
things could be a lot worse for me.
mm.
Um,
I've heard
and
that a lot. Yeah.
so part
Yeah.
of that is, it sounds like you're saying to just accept, to care for yourself by just letting yourself know that it's okay for me to feel
Mhm.
however it is I'm feeling.
Mhm.
Is there a step beyond that, or is that kind of it in terms of emotional regulation right now?
There's a lot to it, I think, but if I can just speak to the guilt thing, because I've heard that come up a lot too. Guilt is usually a symptom of freeze in the nervous system. So again, knowing that like that, even just that very feeling I'm labeling as guilt is an experience of survival a little bit. And I would say like, it's really easy because that's the guilt is, it sounds like almost survivor's guilt, like it's comparison, like others are suffering. And so who am I to complain or even be struggling with the fact that I have to stay in my house but it's like, other people's suffering doesn't cancel ours. That doesn't work that way. And so, yeah, there are people that are really suffering and the front lines right now in the hospital is not stopping working, and yeah, and you are also impacted. So yeah, so I would say emotion regulation is allowing and accepting where you are, but sort of being tender to that without comparing. It's like it's not about other people's suffering to determine whether this is hard for me or not. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting, and that's actually cool you said that because I read in one of Brene Brown's books, um, the one where she talks about it's after Daring Greatly, where she talks about like, oh, rising strong.
Hmm.
She talks about how we often sometimes feel like we can't complain about something if somebody else has it worse. But just because, like you said, somebody else has it worse, that doesn't make it easy for me right now. And that like we should allow space for everybody to be upset regardless of how upset it is, and that like us comparing who is more upset is not really helpful for anybody. um, and so I think that's really cool that you said that, to just sort of say it's okay that I'm still upset and that I still have trouble sleeping at night, even if it's not terrible for me and even if it's a lot worse for other people. That's
Right.
really cool and that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Glad that's helpful. And back to your question about what there is to emotion regulation, I think the best that we can do when our sense of safety is triggered is to kind of allow um, that to be normal in a time like this. It is normal to feel that. So normalizing, not denying, not minimizing. Sometimes if it feels like you're on the brink of overwhelm, sometimes it's healthy and good to distract, to let your body kind of settle while your mind is not making meaning of what's happening, because often like the intensity of emotions get they just really intensify when we label what's happening like, oh my gosh, I'm scared because everyone around me is going to die, or it's starting to go to outcomes that aren't happening yet. And so just to use a personal example, my dad is in one of the most vulnerable categories for this disease in
Mm,
particular. and the,
mm,
and he actually said with his own words the other day, like, I know if I got it, I wouldn't make it. He has a lung condition.
wow.
Um,
Wow.
so it's that the vulnerability of that being true. And also if I run with the possibility of like him dying and I think about that every day, that's not serving me because it's not happening. I don't know if that's going to happen. And so
Right.
regulating myself means that I'm really trying to train my mind to let go of outcomes that aren't here. So
Mm,
it's like, okay, it's normal to feel afraid, and I want to let go of any possibilities that are not there yet. Does that
okay.
make sense? Yeah.
That does, and that's helpful. Let me take a quick step back and ask you this. I'm wondering, like, when we talk about self-care, if let's say I'm really emotionally upset and I'm doing my best to like emotionally regulate and care for myself that way, but it's like, and even if I'm not letting my mind go and live out futures that haven't happened yet, and I'm trying to avoid that, and I'm trying to have compassion on myself, but I'm still just like, it's still hard right now and I'm upset. Like, can we care for ourselves in the other three areas to try to, like you said, maybe distract or like kind of help make things a little bit better? um, like, does it kind of work like that? Like, for instance, a ritual, if I start doing something consistently every day and I start addressing self-care through rituals, will that kind of help compensate for sort of the emotional piece that's really struggling right now?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. Yeah. And that's why it's an imperfect to even make them in domains, because it's almost like a Venn diagram. They're all very much connected.
Right. Okay.
So like you like, yeah, I'm struggling, I'm feeling anxious. Okay, I'm going to get outside today. It's like that's a physical need, but also that helps regulate me. Like looking at the details of flowers and like looking at everything my dog is sniffing that I'm irritated he's sniffing at, like actually looking at it and being mindful and aware of what the nature is outside, it totally
Okay.
regulates me. It totally helps me step down a little bit. So
Okay.
there is this dance of like, I don't want to just swim in my emotions. Like allowing them is different than like indulging totally and believing them. It's sort of like, oh, of course I'm freaked out and I'm going to do my best to try to care for it, which may mean lean in, but care for it may also mean like, okay, let's do something to feel a little bit of relief from this right now, if we have that luxury. And again, some people who have suffering loved ones right now don't have that luxury.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like balance is probably, um, I mean, obviously balance in most, like if you ask a question and then I read this meme where it was like, if you just chime into a meeting, regardless of what you're talking about, like, yeah, everybody, like, I think we should just find a balance. Everybody will say, just so true. It's like, that's like
Yeah,
it's like a buzzword, like, just say balance
yeah,
and like people will agree with you. So I know
yeah,
it's
it's
kind of
true.
cliche to say like that balance is important, but, um, it sounds like that's what you're saying. But maybe we can just do this. Like, I know because you're actively dealing with people who are struggling in therapy right now. You have a lot of experience in this current climate. So, are there maybe we could give a few examples for people um, in each of the four different areas of self-care, some things that can be helpful in each of those areas. Just if people are wanting to say like, okay, I want to start maybe trying to be better about self-care right now, where can I start, and what are a few possibilities that we can start doing, we can start considering right now?
Mm. Yeah, it's really good. Well, it's tricky because it does come with that sort of limitation that every person is different in what needs they already have met and not. So even
Okay.
giving any prescription comes, of course, with the other side, which is like, for me, it's like go out in nature every day. That could be really supportive to me, but it actually for the person who's like trying to find a job, like it's just it's tricky. So I'll give some examples, but while knowing that like one, it's not about the activity, it's about the state of being. And just a precursor to deciding what to do in those four domains, it has to come with some level of self-assessment and honesty with what your needs are and how you've traditionally met them. So one
Okay.
just
Okay.
quick note is that there tends to be sort of a spectrum that we fall on in those four domains, and we could be in different places for each of them, but the spectrum would be like I tend to self-abandon, neglect my needs, or I tend to self-indulge and obsess over kind of myself, or like overdo it, or overextend, or get impulsive and grabby and non-reflective about what I'm doing for myself. An example would be like I got in a fight with my partner and I deserve wine or I deserve ice cream. And it's like a little bit like a responsive or reactivity to hurt, and it's not quite thoughtful, or, so
Right.
there's that side of things. And then there's the sort of self-neglect, which most people, when they're approaching self-care, kind of come from that side. Like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to even care for myself as an adult. But knowing what to do for each of these domains usually means that we have to have honesty and assessment with where we are in each of those categories with that spectrum. Does that make sense?
Okay. Totally. And so, would you say that it's true that both sides, whether you're overindulging or neglecting, is like a way of numbing what you're feeling? Like it's a way of avoiding that self-assessment?
Yeah, you could really say that for both, for sure.
And
Yeah,
it kind of
you
seems
could
like
say that
people
like
who,
both.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh no, there's a delay, so I think we both interrupted each other.
Oh, well, I was going to say that it sounds like the people who are overindulging are that can easily be labeled as self-care, right? I mean, because it kind of can look like it. Like I'm just going to drink, like drink a glass of wine, eat some ice cream, and just like watch TV all night because, that's what I really need right now. Um, but if that's not met with like an actual assessment of where you're at, then you're just overindulging yourself in a way that's not really helpful. Like it's not really caring for yourself, right?
Yes, exactly. For for that person who's prone to that, because then there's people who are self-neglectful who tend to eat with like really rigid boundaries around food and don't allow themselves dessert, and then they get a glass of wine and have ice cream, and it is self-care because it is allowing, it's more flexible, it's more, it's more caring because it's tending to something that's needed, like an emotional need. And food gets complicated talking about it that way, but does that make sense? There are people
Yeah.
who are patterns are just sort of like impulsive. I'm going to have whatever I want, but that's the pattern. So it's not really care. It's not really
Right.
listening. And then there's the abandonment, which is like, like I feel guilty for even thinking of like allowing myself to do something I don't allow myself to do.
Right.
So it
Okay.
really depends on where you are.
So you have to kind of first understand which group you tend to lean closer towards. And
With
then that,
each domain.
right,
I could
right.
give an example if it would
Okay,
help. I
sure,
have,
sure.
so for food, for example, so that would be a physical body need. In fact, the whole domain of physical body need for me, I would say, because I didn't have super good models growing up around those areas, and there was some neglect when it came to food, and access to healthy food was pretty limited. And so my experience of what self-care looks like when it came to the body was on that sort of neglect side. So when I first came to this idea of self-care, I would tend to overshoot and say, I can have whatever I want, whenever I want. It's like that was my way of trying to get the need met around the abandonment that I experienced with that area. And at the same time, it was abandoning because it was not actually meeting my needs. So nutrition was not really a thing, like exercise, didn't do it until like a couple years ago, just like was not on my radar, not important. So that was kind of where it was with that. And so stepping into it was scary. I felt guilty. I felt like, oh, these are too many rules for myself and stuff. So I had to be really like intentional. I had to pause and reflect. I had to give myself compassion anytime I had the impulse to just eat whatever I wanted again. And again, food gets tricky because we're all going to be in different places, but
Right,
nutrition specifically was like, no. This idea that I don't need nutrition or I shouldn't indulge in that way. There's a lot of narratives and beliefs around that. So when we're talking about where we are in the spectrum, it's really important to kind of have a sense for what your conditioning was. So for rest, that's a really common one for people in the area of rest in like physical care, is there's going to be some narratives around that. So one question would be, how did my family treat rest? Was it allowed? Was it like work hard, play, what is the saying? Like work hard,
work
play
hard, play
hard,
it. Yeah,
but you have to, yeah, there's always like business first, play later or something. There's a lot of like American ideals around like having to work yourself to death before you can earn like a nap or something. And that's
okay,
not really praised. So we want to look at our family and society and, you know, any personality preferences that are going to be in there too, like around what it's supposed to look like. What is the belief I have about taking naps, for example? So that's going to give us an idea of where we start. Like, oh,
okay.
rest is for the wicked. What is the saying?
Yeah,
I'm so
the
bad with
way.
saying. I'm
I
terrible
think
on them.
there's no rest for the weary,
Oh, is
but
that it?
but I t- but the wicked too. Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
the
I hear
wicked.
what you're saying. Yeah, yeah. um, that's really funny. So, yeah, and that's the self-assessment, right? Figuring out in each of these different areas sort of where you might tend to gravitate more towards, and then that will give you an idea of if you're more neglectful of, let's say, your needs, then indulging those is kind of the natural, like, next step. Like, I normally don't rest. I feel guilty when I rest. So today I'm going to just do nothing and just have an off day. That's being overindulgent in the area of rest. But, well, you could view it that way, but I'm just saying you're like really indulging in a restful activity. And if you're normally neglecting it, then that's healthy. But like, what if you naturally overindulge? Then what is, like, approaching rest, for instance, as self-care? How do you like kind of go more towards the other end of the spectrum, or like what does that look like going the other direction?
Sorry, I'm like laughing because it was a little bit choppy, but I think I got what you said.
Oh, great.
Which is, it's okay. I think I got what you said, which is like, if you're on this side of self-neglect, you are going to try to indulge some of those things that you think are off limits or you're not allowed to, or that you feel guilty for, which, by the
Right.
way, a good question for the self-neglectful would be, am I actually harming someone? Is it actually objectively hurtful to take a nap? So we want to really
Wow.
look at and examine guilt when it shows up for self-neglectful people. It's going to be the most common side effect of self-care, is feeling guilty, like I'm not allowed. Question, did I actually do something wrong? The other side, the opposite of guilt, is sort of, I'm entitled. I can just have this. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm allowed to do whatever I want. So the question might
Right.
be, is this impacting anyone else? So an example of like, I show up late to work every day because I slept in because of self-care. It's like, you're going to lose your job. Like, what is the impact on others, that you feel so entitled to that thing? And so moving towards the middle, it isn't moving towards abandonment. It's not, that's not the goal. The middle is, can I at the very least enjoy the fact that I'm doing this? Can I do it a little bit more mindfully? Because usually when we feel entitled to something, it's like, it's not quite going in, the resource isn't actually being received. So can we at least slow down on the impulse and say, okay, I think I deserve a bubble bath every day. Okay, can I actually mindfully enjoy what the water and bubbles feel like tonight, instead of like, I don't know, whatever non-reflective action might look like, Instagramming the whole thing or something. I don't know.
Right. Yes. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So, and I know this is probably everybody listening understands this, but um, but for me, I am still trying to grasp the whole thing in its entirety. And it sounds like you're saying, because for me, I naturally think, well, if somebody is naturally more neglectful, then indulging themselves is like self-care. And so the opposite extension would be, if somebody's more indulgent, then like doing less of that activity is like more self-care, but that's like going towards neglect, and that's what you're saying is actually not the case. It's like somebody who's more indulgent just needs to be more mindful of being more present during that activity, so that they're actually getting something beneficial out of it, instead of just overindulging in whatever activity they're doing and numbing out what they're feeling, and it not actually be helpful for them. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so, because what we're, going back to your point from the beginning, is that this is more about a way of being than it is about the activity. And so for both sides, really, it's not about, like, I know you gave the example of the person who doesn't rest, then like that's self-neglectful, that they would move towards indulging that. But even that, it may not be true for someone. For example, someone who's like a CEO that like runs like 80, like works 80-hour weeks and just can't slow down, can't do that. Asking them to do a 20-minute meditation would be insane. Like, they couldn't do it. That was a lot of my life, was functioning at a really high level of hyperactivity. And I went to my first yoga class, and I bawled my eyes out. I couldn't slow down. Like, it was super
Mm,
intense for me. And so, it's not about opposite action. We could make it that way, but that'd be oversimplifying it, because it's not about just like, don't do it, do more of it. That's a really simple linear way of seeing it. It may be true, but it may not. So it may be actually trying 5 minutes of rest for that CEO type person. It might be 5 minutes of yoga instead of a whole class, and feeling the intensity of having to slow down like that. So
okay.
and it's about trial and error too. We have to kind of test, like, is it a diaper, for a baby, is it a diaper change, is it crying because they need to be held, it's like trying
Mm,
to trial and error what it might actually be to satisfy that need. So then the other side of things, like you said, the indulgent side, well, just to slow that down, both sides, the invitation is the intention behind the action. So if it's not about the action, it's about the intention, which would be just a little bit more self-compassion, a little bit more awareness of the need that's trying to get met, um, which would take some presence, like pausing a little bit before I do or not do something, asking myself the question, like, how am I prone to handling self-care? What do I actually believe about self-care, about rest, those four domains? What do I really believe about emotions, about resting when I should rest, about if is it selfish, not selfish? Do I deserve it? Do I not? Do I compare to others? In all those
mm,
domains. Pleasure, like a lot of religious communities have a lot of narratives around pleasure and like how it's
right.
bad to seek it.
Right.
right? So like having an
Right.
understanding of where you are with those areas of physical care, um, pleasure, emotion regulation, and rituals for yourself. Rituals, for some personalities is going to feel harder for them. So again, like for my personality, someone telling me I should meditate every single day 5 years ago, that would have been like really intense. Like, no, 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 I'm not going to do anything every single day except for maybe wake up. That's it. So that's not self-care, that's self-torture. And
Right.
again, I was more in that indulgent side of thing when it came to pleasure, the pleasure category. I would say I was more indulgent.
Hmm.
So then learning to slow down and give rituals, moving towards that was helpful for me, but in a very slow, doable way.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
and being
Cool. That's
mindful
really
was,
great. Yeah. And I think that's a great takeaway and probably a really good place for us to end the conversation. I know we just kind of, got down below the surface, but, these things aren't easy to understand because, like you said, there's no way that we can, if we oversimplify it, we're not doing anybody any good. Right. And that's what happens if we're being overindulgent. It's just an oversimplification of, I'm stressed, like I'm just gonna sit here and eat ice cream and and that's gonna be me taking care of myself. But like you said, and I do want to try to encourage everybody to do that too, is to just look a little bit deeper and have a better understanding, a more clear understanding of what's going on. And I think, like you said, knowing where you're at on the spectrum in terms of if you're more neglectful of your needs versus more indulgent can give you a good idea of what direction your self-care needs to go. But
mm-hmm.
yeah, this is really great. And I'm kind of hoping that over the course of the next couple of weeks, because it looks like this shelter in place is going to stay at least until the beginning of May. So I know, like for me personally, like I can't work. I haven't worked in the past month, and so I'll will probably be out like 2 months worth of salary. Um, but like I said, um, it's it's just crazy. It's crazy because I want to say, like, I just want to follow that up with, like, but I know a lot of people have it a lot worse,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean that's what I was gonna say, but and I just paused because I just realized I was just kind of caught up in what we were just talking about, which is the need to not just feel comfortable saying that sucks. I'm really bummed about it, but to try to hedge it with the idea that it's not that bad compared to what else is out there. Um and so
Yeah.
that is going to be probably my own personal struggle, is to just not be so caught up in like the comparison, comparing what I'm going through and comparing it to the other people out there. um and so that's kind of like
I think
my
that's really
own,
good.
yeah, my own personal struggle probably right now. Um But this is something, like I said, maybe over the next couple of weeks, we can get some feedback from people and see if there's some of the things that we want to talk about more. And I think having conversations like this are really helpful. It's helpful for me, and I know it's helpful for a lot of people. So thanks, Kylie.
Yeah, you're welcome. My pleasure. I know it's a complicated topic, and I wish there was a universal. Like we get a lot of memes about like what the universal care is, but
Right.
then we try it and it's like, wait, that didn't actually feel that good. So it's really just
Yeah.
learning ourselves, learning what we need. So it's good. It's good work.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Kylie. All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and we will catch you next time. Bye.